Hello and good morning, everybody. It's me, Julian, and welcome to the Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. Today, I would like to discuss Fredric Jameson's book, The Years of Theory, which is a really good introduction to what he calls the French philosophical and theoretical moment, the movement of various thinkers that begins with Sartre and existentialism, but that eventually finds its way into phenomenology, semiotics, structuralism, post-structuralism, and even postmodernism, what Jameson deems the end of philosophy. And what I'd like to do in this short lecture is give you a simple and accessible introduction to some of the arguments that he lays out in the opening chapter, the introduction of this book. I should also say that this is an unusual and highly readable book in that it is a collection of lectures that he gave, seminars, towards the end of his life. They're essentially transcripts of what you might call a pandemic project in which he lays out the parameters of post-war French intellectual thought and their corresponding movements. I know that we've had some issues with the internet as of late, so fingers crossed that we can get through an entire lecture. Just to be safe, I am also recording this to a microphone, which means that I can post it to Patreon. If you'd like to become a patron, you can access a bonus seminar that I record live on Discord and post as an audio file, in which I answer subsequent questions from students and listeners. You can also get the edited transcripts for all of my lectures, the audio downloads for each and every one of my lectures, as well as an ongoing ebook series in which I summarize and explore further the key concepts I've explored and introduced in said lectures. All of which is to say, I am so happy to be back, and I'm glad that you are here with me this morning. It feels like a classroom, which means a lot to me. And if you'd like to support this channel, and if you'd like to go further in your learning, please do consider becoming a patron. Now, what I'd like to do today, oh, and one more thing. I was rewatching one of my lectures, which I never do because it's frightful to me to see myself on camera. But I was rewatching one of my lectures to see where the audio had glitched. And it suddenly occurred to me that amidst this lecture, there were ad breaks, interruptions, which is horrible. And it suddenly dawned on me just how much you guys have had to put up with. And so starting today, I'm going to get rid of all of the ads on these live stream lectures. No more ads. I apologize belatedly for those interruptions. So hopefully you can enjoy these entire lectures ad-free. That seems important to me. Okay, let's begin. So the book is called The Years of Theory, Post-War French Thought to the Present by Fredric Jameson. And if you're unfamiliar with Fredric Jameson, I've posted a lecture a while back, shortly after his passing, in which I laid out some of his most well-known theoretical and philosophical concepts and ideas. But what I'd like to do here is I'd like to give you his main arguments that he lays out here. First of all, the task of philosophy is the creation and examination of problems, which is to say, philosophy is not simply about ideas as such. It's not just about human thought. It is about specific problematics. What in French, it's the same word, but he puts it in French, a kind of problématique. And for example, if you think about Foucault, Foucault doesn't simply write about the body or about philosophy or wisdom or truth. Foucault examines what you might call power structures. In other words, not how to acquire power, but the manner in which power tacitly impacts our lives and is self-imposed by us, what Foucault eventually calls biopolitics. Here we can see a philosophical problem, the problem of power, changing over time. For Aristotle, the question would be, how is power to be used appropriately? Whereas within post-structuralism, for example, Foucault, the question becomes, how is power something that we don't always experience as such? Okay, but let me take a step back and explain another one of Jameson's arguments. I think this is actually a really important one, especially if you're a beginning student. He says, strictly speaking, we shouldn't think of the history of philosophy as a linear trajectory. In other words, it's not the best thoughts thought up by the greatest minds. It's not a Bertrand Russell style reduction of the history of Western philosophy in which we can pick and choose and take some ideas that we think are worth retaining and rejecting others to the trash bin of history. Instead, Jameson argues that philosophy essentially occurs in bursts, in philosophical moments. And he identifies three such moments. The first philosophical moment, the explosion of philosophy, if you will, is the movement that takes place between the discussion between Parmenides and Socrates, and subsequently between Socrates and Plato, and between Plato and Aristotle. Between Socrates and Aristotle, we have essentially two foundational movements within Western philosophy, that which would become Neoplatonism and that which would become Aristotelianism, and eventually a metaphysical and rationalist approach to the world. And to simplify somewhat, Plato and Aristotle have very differing worldviews. In fact, you could even make the argument that Aristotle's Lyceum was a counter movement to Plato's idea of the gymnasium. But again, to simplify somewhat, the problem that Plato is preoccupied with is the problem of essences, or the ideal of truth. In other words, it's a fundamentally metaphysical project, a system above all, a system of metaphysics. Aristotle's approach, on the other hand, is much more engaged with the idea of teleological problems. In other words, what is something for? If you want to make a very strict binary here, which is somewhat misleading but perhaps helpful, you could say that Plato is interested in ontology, namely the nature of what something is, what is its essence, and Aristotle is interested in what purpose something serves, namely what is it for, teleology. Where is it heading? Now, to give you a little preview of where we're going, one of Hegel's innovation is essentially to turn teleology into ontology, but we'll get there. So here we have the first philosophical moment, according to Jameson, the explosion of philosophy, which is, of course, also a reaction to sophism. One of the things that outraged Plato, and we should believe Socrates, about the sophists was precisely that they were not systematizers, that they weren't interested in any system of philosophy. They weren't even interested in problems of philosophy, if you put it that way. They were interested in the idea of philosophy in the world. Aristotle is the continuation by other means of this very movement. Aristotle himself is a great systematizer, except not one of essences or ideals, but one who examines the world around them and begins to place them in taxonomical categories, and also introduces what are essentially the formal ways of looking at the world. Formal and normative, meaning that they correspond to certain attributes, which are then deemed to be either virtuous or not virtuous, just or not just, etc. Now here we have the explosion of philosophy in its earliest moment, Western philosophy that is. The second philosophical moment occurs much later, which is to say philosophy essentially goes to sleep. It exists, but it's still a ripple effect of Neoplatonism and Aristotelianism. Simone Weil once wrote in her diaries that ultimately she always wanted to know which camp people were in. Were they Aristotelians or were they Platonists? And even today you can see some of those resonances where much of Anglican philosophy and sort of the kind of philosophy that goes toward logic tends to be Aristotelian in nature, whereas the so-called continental movements tend to be Platonic in their origins. But the second explosion of philosophy occurs when we have Fichte, or I should perhaps say Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hölderlin, which I think we can include here, as well as Hegel. And this is truly an explosion that is also about proximity, because much of this takes place, apart from Kant, of course, in Jena. Fichte is lecturing at Jena. Hegel and Schelling are roommates. Schelling is friends with Hölderlin, who also knows Hegel, etc. We have here an explosion of philosophical creativity. And once again, it's about the exploration of problems. What Kant essentially does is that he's interested in the problem of essences and how we might see them or think them, which is to say, Kant essentially applies a critical, or if you will, empirical attitude towards the problems or categories of reason as such. I've mentioned this before, but I will say it again. The critique of pure reason essentially articulates a paradox of sorts, which is how can the idea of essence be conceived of if the very act of conceiving it, namely by means of reason, already renders it into a concept, therefore being no longer essential? I.e., is it possible that reason both tarnishes the essential, but nevertheless is essential to it? And this basic paradox for Kant creates the ontologically inadmissible entity, which he calls the thing in itself. The thing, the essence of essence, which cannot be thought, because if you think it, you've already devalued it or tarnished it. It's already become conceptualized by reason. In other words, he tries to use reason to get rid of the problem of reason, which he conceives of as a kind of metaphysical barrier to essence. There's more to be said about Kant, of course, but please do consider going back to some of my other introductory lectures on Kant. The point here is that Kant ushers in a new problematic that's so exciting in its consequences that it challenges an entire generation of thinkers to come up with their own attitudes towards it. Now, Fichte is perhaps today not so well known, but in his time was an absolute phenomenon, hugely popular. And essentially the Kantian problematic created two extreme responses. Either we have the Fichtean response, which goes into complete idealization of the subjective, which is to say Fichte basically says the subject posits itself and thereby reality, which means that the subject is itself essence refracted. The Ich-Philosophie, which at the time was so popular that even Goethe, who spent much of his time in Vienna, surrounded by many of these new thinkers, would sign off his letters sometimes instead of Goethe, he would say, the I who is positing itself. Very, very popular idea. You could call it, if you will, the existentialism of the German Romantic moment. But this was contrasted with another Romantic response, and yet one which is completely juxtaposed to it, which is that of Schelling and the idealization of nature as a kind of Ursubstanz, as a kind of ontologically sealed off natural absolute to which the subject has only limited access, which is a mysticism of sorts. In fact, one of the ironic things to me is that Hegel is often characterized as a mystic thinker, when Hegel is actually responding quite rationally, at least in comparison to his peers, to the idealization of Fichtean subjectivism and the idealization of Schellingian romanticism. But that's for another time. So here we have the second explosion, the second moment in philosophical thought. The Kantian problematic, the critique of pure reason, and the responses to it, including Kant's responses to it, I should say, who never really got over the problem that he himself had introduced. And so we have Fichte, we have Schelling, we have Hölderlin, the poet, we have Hegel. And Hegel becomes sort of the climactic figure of this entire movement. We could also add Novalis to this movement as well, but he's perhaps less related to the Kantian problematic here and more closely to the Romantics as such. Of course, after Hegel, we have an entire ripple effect itself. We have the sort of the Hegelians, the new Hegelians, Feuerbach, who essentially applies like a theological application of new Hegelianism. And one of the things that Jameson argues is that this sort of culminates in Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, who themselves are reacting to Hegel, even in as much as they reject him. I would personally also add Kierkegaard to this moment, because I think Kierkegaard, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche sort of function as these ripple figures who kind of demarcate a certain line. And of course, we would be amiss to be talking about the influences of Hegel without mentioning the most influential Hegelian himself, namely Karl Marx. But there we're already getting ahead of ourselves. So the second philosophical moment, if you will, is this moment of the explosion of German idealism and romanticism. In fact, it's often joked that what the Germans lacked in political revolutions, at least compared to the French, they made up for by means of philosophical revolutions, German idealism. Now, the third, and this is really the crux of Jameson's argument, the third philosophical moment, explosion of philosophical thought, occurs in France after World War II, in the mid-40s, but really peaks in the 1950s. This is what Jameson refers to as les 50 glorieuses. And his argument here, and I want to be careful at how I lay this out, his argument isn't so much that the 1950s in France constitute an explosion of philosophical thought, but rather that they announce an explosion of philosophical problems, which to say, strictly speaking, the two moments that he lays out, the moment of antiquity and the moment of German idealism, are nevertheless moments that are systems. These are great moments in which philosophy becomes highly formalized and systematized. And yet what happens in 1950s and 60s France, leading into the 70s and 80s, of course, is that philosophy is opened up. It breaks, it's like a river that breaks its banks. In fact, there's a joke that he mentions in which Sartre and Beauvoir are in a cafe where they would work and entertain guests, etc. And someone comes in and they tell them about phenomenology. And Sartre says, well, what's phenomenology about? Like, what does it do? And the guest says, well, you could have a theory of the beer sitting in front of you right now. And here we have the opening up of philosophy. Suddenly philosophy becomes applicable to things in our daily life. It's essentially the philosophical and critical examination of the everyday. And here we have an explosion of philosophical applicability, namely the idea that everything that you do in your day is governed either by structural linguistic systems or patterns of more overt power and also exploitation. In other words, philosophy becomes critical. It becomes theoretical. We have essentially the emergence of a modernist philosophical turn by which philosophy becomes not just applicable to one's daily life, but in that sense, deeply critical of the status quo and the powers that be. And it's worth pointing out that philosophy up until then had been essentially conservative, which to say, if you go back to Plato and Aristotle, but also the German idealists, the task of philosophy was the articulation of problems, but ultimately ones that were supposed to serve the public and the common good, and various abstract notions thereof. The French philosophical moment completely changes this. Suddenly, the point of philosophy is to philosophize everything. Of course, we see this coming full circle in what Badiou later calls the end of philosophy, namely how everything has become philosophy. The philosophy of cats, the philosophy of motorbikes, the philosophy of cooking, etc. This universalization of the philosophy of is actually a tacitly reductionist stance that reduces philosophy back to its non-critical supplementary nature. The French philosophical movement, on the other hand, seeks precisely to undermine this. A philosophy of cooking wouldn't be about how you can apply Zen habits to cooking, but would be about investigating the colonial and power structures that go into the process by which food finds its way onto your table and the signifiers of codification of what meals you make, etc. It's an explosion of critical creativity, if you will. And so one of Jameson's goals in this book, which I will not do here myself, is to essentially lay out this trajectory, the development of French thought. And he says that the catalyst for this movement is Sartre's Being a Nothingness. And when I read that, I thought it was kind of interesting, actually, because so much of French philosophical thought as we know it, like structuralism, etc., is actually a reaction against Sartrean existentialism. Because Sartrean existentialism very much steps aside from the continuation of philosophy and Hegelianism and Marxism, etc. And now we can get back to the unnamed character here, namely Karl Marx. One of the important things to note about Karl Marx is that even though he's a Hegelian, he also ushers in what you might call the end of philosophy, which is to say, one of the things that happens within the 19th century is that various philosophical positions begin to emerge that take place outside the realm of philosophy as such. For example, Marx, his work is in the realm of political economy and what you might even refer to as a sort of grand narrative societal critique. This isn't to say that Hegel wasn't interested in culture and religion and art, etc., but Marx is creating a system that specifically rejects the idea of idealist philosophical systems and seeks to, quote unquote, ground it in materialism and a theory of a political economy, to render philosophy a science in this way. But we have against this movement also the emergence of psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis seeks to do something very similar, which is to say the essentially modernist gesture of psychoanalysis is that it is philosophy by other means. It's investigating the so-called structure of the unconscious, the subject of the unconscious. In other words, here we have two investigations that derive from the Hegelian problematic. Remember that I said that Hegel essentially turned ontology or teleology into ontology. It's not about the essences of things, nor about their purpose or what they're for. Instead, to understand the essence is to understand what they are for, where they are going. In other words, we have here an essentially historicist kernel that finds its way into philosophy, namely the examination of the present and the historical, socio-political context in which thought takes place. Here we have perhaps the ideal of the Aristotelian and Hegelian notion of thought thinking itself. Marx's inquiry into the functioning of capitalism is a process of understanding the problems of the present moment in a way that has hitherto not been thought before. Psychoanalysis is the emergence of a movement that seeks to problematize the notion of subjectivity and the experience of consciousness in a way that has not been done before, and this is crucial, could only have been done against the backdrop of the emerging modern consciousness. In other words, within psychoanalysis and the emergence of Marxism, we already have the emergence of an anti-philosophical stance, or perhaps to be more precise, the continuation of philosophy by other means. Excuse me. Hegel's dialectic and Hegel's phenomenology of spirit essentially declares the end of philosophy, or at least the end of an essentialist dialectical system of philosophy as such. Excuse me, I'm going to drink something real quick. And so the emergence of Freudian psychoanalysis and Marxist critique of political economy essentially already creates a very fertile soil against which the moment of French theory can emerge. And this moment of French theory, therefore, is once again anti-philosophical. Lacanian psychoanalysis, which is deeply indebted to structuralism, or Levi-Straussian anthropological structuralism, Saussurean linguistics, phenomenology, even structuralism. These are anti-philosophical movements, and that fundamentally they're not seeking to lay out a system as such, nor are they interested in the inquiry into metaphysical essences or truth. In fact, they entirely reject this. Instead, they focus on subjective stance on the world, the creation of the subject and the body by means of speech, by means of actions, by means of will. And here again, we can see the ripple effects of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. In fact, existentialism would be unimaginable without Nietzsche and without Schopenhauer. Now, what I'd like to do here to conclude briefly is I'd like to briefly introduce the problem, if you will, of postmodernism. And Fredric Jameson makes the somewhat controversial, but I think understandable argument that postmodernism is both the end of philosophy and the emergence of what you might call an American philosophy, an American philosophical moment. Now, he traces the emergence of postmodernism back to the French thought thinkers, including, for example, Deleuze, who he says is essentially postmodern. It moves away from the modernist problematics into those of the postmodern. But the reason that he calls it an American political moment is that postmodernism is a form of thought that is also distinctly suited to the emergence of the American articulation of meaning, which is to say, it is fractured, it is meta-referential, it is something which both could not exist without theory and without the emergence of the French moment and the Frankfurt School, quote-unquote, German moment of critical theory, and yet also dissolves it to some extent. Which is to say, the logical conclusion of the French philosophical moment, the opening up of philosophy, is also that fundamentally philosophy can be anything. It can be the philosophy, you can write the philosophy of music, you can write the philosophy of agriculture, philosophy of X. And so this very opening up of philosophy also means that philosophy becomes detached from some of its problematics. It becomes detached from its tradition. And in this sense, postmodern thought represents the very same detachedness that occurs within the production of art, within the commodification of culture, within the self-conception of modern lifestyle enthusiasm. In other words, we have a risky moment in which philosophy becomes itself simply another lifestyle facet. You can choose your own philosophy. You can be whatever kind of philosopher you want to be. In fact, and I think this is important to note, and this is my own argument, is that even though people who say that they are stoicists and who subscribe to Stoic philosophy or the so-called Nietzsche bros, etc., are essentially following a postmodern impulse, which is the idea that philosophy is this all-you-can-eat buffet from which you can choose whichever dish you like best and then gorge yourself on it. This idea that philosophical moments can be chosen at random according to the logic of which is best applicable to you in your life is a postmodern idea. It's actually not going back to the classics. It's a distinctly postmodern attitude towards philosophical self-education, one which, in once again characteristically postmodern fashion, displays itself as being anti-postmodern. Here we have a snake eating its own tail. Of course, we have a dead end within philosophy, hence why Jameson argues that postmodernism signals the death of philosophy, or the end of philosophy as such. And the problem, therefore, one which I've tried to address in some of my lectures, is how do we go back to some of the problems of modernism, but in a way that goes through postmodernism, not beyond the postmodern, for the postmodern becomes this eternally recurrent loop, but how do we go through its very problem? In other words, how do we find a postmodern moment, a moment of metamodernism, if you will? And perhaps our contemporary constellation, to put it in Adornian terms, which is to say the sort of reorientation of our world as it is currently taking place, is an opportunity for such thought to emerge, something which I believe can only be done collectively. And my hope is that these lectures contribute to such an understanding, but also invite you into the process of reading and discovering philosophy yourself. On which note, I would like to conclude by saying that Jameson's mission here is to essentially lay out the field. It's an invitation for people to study philosophy themselves. His basic project, which I fully agree with and which is very instructive in my own thinking, has been very instructive in my own thinking, is that in order to really engage with philosophy, one has to understand the connection between different philosophical moments and thinkers. And so this is not a history of the best of human thought, which would be a vulgar characterization of philosophy, I believe. But instead, it's a very gentle and accessible introduction to the way in which philosophical moments interconnect. And to that end, he comes up with this idea of the moment of French theory, what he calls the years of theory. We can talk more about this in the seminar that I will record after this lecture. But first of all, I hope that the internet has been better today Thank you so much for being with me here this morning. I see that there are currently 53 people, which is utterly remarkable. So thank you so much. If you'd like to go a little bit deeper into these classes, please do consider becoming a patron, but otherwise, simply stick around. I'm very bad at these conclusions. Stick around and hope to see you next Monday. Thank you so much, and I will see you soon.